So imagine a place called Mel's Ice Cream Parlor and Transmission Shop. And you're Mel, and you have an arrangement with your local organized crime syndicate. And every month, some henchman from the local mob would come and see you, and you would give them $1,000. And what did you get for that money? Well, for a measly $1,000, the local mob would protect your business. No one would rob you or come in and ransack your ice cream parlor or its adjoining auto repair business. Well, that isn't the story that I wanted to tell you, but that's an illustration of the fix that King Jehoiakim of Judah was in, paying tribute to King Nebuchadnezzar so that his kingdom would not be invaded. And that's what tributes are for. Holding countries hostages to fear. It was called a tax or a tribute, but for those of us whose guilty pleasure is shows about organized crime, it's just protection money, pure and simple. It was just powerful, the powerful leaning on the weak. Just a school bully demanding your lunch money on a grand scale. So this went on for about 3 years, after which King Jehoiakim decided that enough was enough, and he stopped his payments to Babylon's king. So, the bluff having been called, Babylon was forced to invade Judah whether they really wanted to or not. Their reputation was at stake. And say what you want about the tribute racket, it had its advantages. Judah was saved the cost of being invaded, and Babylon saved the cost of having to go to war. And in those days, weak, small countries paying tribute to powerful, big countries was an exceedingly common practice. Another practice of conquest that might strike us as unusual in this day is the exile of populations. What happened in this case was Babylon took people whose skills and talents might benefit them and find others to install alongside the Judaites who they never left their homeland. It was left both groups dispirited and longing for a home they would never see again. It was a cruel practice and intended to be. As was the case with paying tribute, this was not an uncommon thing in those days. This is not about Mel or ice cream shops or transmission places. This is the story of the conquest of Judah and the soon-to-follow Babylonian captivity, and what happened so long ago and so far away to people so unlike us might be hard to relate to, but we understand the story better imagining the very human feelings of the Jews who were thrust into a new culture in Babylon, who were still very proud of their heritage, but being a Jew had always been connected to being in their homeland and having a temple. And here they were, far away from Judah, their temple in ruins. So they were forced for the first time to grapple with this question. What is it like to be, what did it mean to be a Jew in this faraway land? And this was in circumstances they couldn't have conceived of. With no temple left to them, the synagogue came into being, where they studied the scriptures continuously, and many Bible scholars believe that the Old Testament took its final form there. Those Jews who were left in Judah, those Jews were equally proud of their heritage, and they were left in a land half full of foreigners whom they'd been taught to look down on. But now these foreigners were their neighbors, and this remnant of Jews discovered that these new people were much like them. They too were adapting to new ways and circumstances they hadn't even dreamt of. They intermarried and became one with these people who had once been strangers but who are now living among them. The temple in Jerusalem, once the heart and soul of their faith, had been destroyed. They built a new temple, though not in Jerusalem because that still lay in ruins, and worshiped there. They acknowledged only the 5 books of Moses as true scripture, and that became the basis of their faith. There were other differences, but more along the lines of the difference between Methodists and Presbyterians. Certainly not a wholesale rejection of Judaism. They weren't giving up. They were clawing their way back to a faith that made sense to them. And then the unthinkable happened. Bit by bit, Jews who had been abducted and taken to faraway Babylonia began coming back. The Jews who had remained in Judah had spent those 60 or 70 years tilling the soil, tending to their animals or vineyards, and being in community with their former adversaries. But they still considered themselves to be every bit as Jewish as their long-lost brothers, and they welcomed them. That feeling was not reciprocated. In fact, the returning Jews shunned them, having figured out quickly that the poor farmers and shepherds which had never left had married with foreigners, which is to their very orthodox mindset of the returning Jews was a betrayal of the faith, contaminating the bloodline. The Jews returning from the exile and the Jews who never left were alike in most ways. But the returning Jews, who saw themselves as the preservers of the faith, focused on their differences rather than on how alike they were. The returning Jews took to calling the Jews half-Jews, quarter-Jews, or worse. And finally the name Samaritans struck. And this was nearly 600 years before Jesus walked among us. And the Samaritans and the Jews had been the bitterest of enemies for all that time. Christians who read the Bible on a regular basis often favor the New Testament, and of that they're often rereading the same favorite stories and verses, and if they venture into the Old Testament at all, it's likely to be to the Psalms or Proverbs, either to be inspired or comforted. That's not a bad thing. Our favorite stories are our favorites for a reason. They often speak to us as nothing else can. And as for being inspired and comforted, there isn't anything wrong with that either. We have moments where we badly need to be comforted. And there are seasons in our lives when moments of inspiration are few and far between. And if you've tried one of those read the Bible in a year programs, it seems like a noble and worthy ambition. But you may get bogged down in the genealogies, the who begat who parts, or the complicated Mosaic law can be rather tedious. And you get discouraged, and sooner or later you realize you have gone 3 or 4 days without reading anything from the Bible at all. And while you feel a little guilty about it, it's not enough to make you go back. It is, then, the Bible. It's the most famous book most of us wish we'd read but haven't. We cherry pick. We stick with the greatest hits. And 2 of Jesus' most familiar stories are the woman at the well and, of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Jesus made the Samaritan the hero of the story once, and at the very least, a human being whom we could all relate to. That was revolutionary. There was the story of Jesus healing 10 lepers, and only one returned to thank him. And that one healed leper was a Samaritan, as was the woman at the well. And the Good Samaritan story has so seeped into our culture at this point that all 50 states have some version of Good Samaritan law. Now, all I knew for decades was that the Jews hated the Samaritans without really understanding why. But now you and I at least have a glimpse of it, and it's also something that tells us what a counter-cultural, revolutionary figure that Jesus was. Now, next week, I'll look at the story of the woman at the well and appreciate how Jesus, unknown with love and compassion. This is a story that asks us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves how we treat the outsiders in our lives, in our society. This is Les from Springfield, and I hope that you will join me then.